going to serve as chair for this next panel, which is entitled The IGY and Beyond, From the Earth to the Solar System. Our speaker, our historian speaker this morning is Sylvia Kraemer. Sylvia is a former chief historian with NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Another locale which has magnificent archives, easy to use but not used enough by historians. Sylvia, in retirement, has taken up another passion, which is as an artist, but she remains an historian. She's the author of several publications and 3 books, including most recently, Science and Technology Policy in the United States, Open Systems in Action. Sylvia.
I'm waiting for my photo here. There we go. Now you may think, when you look at this photograph, which shows William Pickering, James Van Allen, and Wernher von Braun, that you're looking at 4 actors in the launch of the space age. But you aren't. 3, you are not. You are looking at 4. And sharp eyes will detect the walls of the Great Hall of the National Academy building as the place where that photo was taken. Complex human events like the beginning of space exploration are endlessly fascinating to historians because they typically consist of many moving parts. Individuals and institutions that enable those moving parts to function together effectively are among the most important and most underappreciated actors in the history of human enterprise. In the exploration of space, the National Academy of Sciences played this essential role, coordinating and mediating a number of essential moving parts. First, and quite literally foremost, was the sun. The periodic flares and electromagnetic storms known as the solar maximum were due to recur in 1958, creating a rare opportunity for global and atmospheric science. Second was the preparatory work done during the late 1940s on rocketry at Caltech and elsewhere. At White Sands, New Mexico, Army and Navy Ordnance Bureaus and the Office of Naval Research launched rockets into the upper atmosphere that consisted initially of reassembled German V-2 rockets with scientific instruments instead of explosives in their warheads. Third were the scientists and technicians from universities, as well as the military services, who designed the scientific rocket payloads and reviewed the results of each flight. They provided the core of the unofficial Upper Atmosphere Rocket Research Panel formed in 1946. The panel was led by James Van Allen after the panel's founder, Ernest Krauss of the Naval Research Laboratory, resigned in 1947. Members of the panel, such as Homer Newell of NRL and later of NASA, along with James Van Allen and William Pickering of the California Institute of Technology, would become key figures in the scientific exploration of space in the next 3 decades. Fourth were the institutional capabilities of those among the nation's universities that had rapidly grown their physical science faculties and research plans under the stimulus of World War II and early Cold War federal grants and contracts. Fifth, the national security environment. Launching an artificial satellite into orbit required the capabilities of guided missiles. Until the creation of NASA in 1958, the only institution in the United States both able and authorized to launch guided missiles was the military. The National Academy of Sciences, and especially its U.S. National Committee for the International Geophysical Year, with its technical panel on the Earth Satellite Program, coordinated and mediated among these moving parts. As it did so, it laid the template for the future conduct of the U.S. civil space exploration. This template had 3 salient features. First, socializing risk and privatizing gains. has been the national policy for the promotion of research and development in this country ever since the first federal R&D contract was negotiated with Eli Whitney in 1798. But in the post-World War II era of big science and technology, socializing risk and privatizing gains became a far more complicated task than merely issuing a contract from an office in the War Department. The Academy mastered that complexity. The second salient feature is pluralism. While the federal government has financed much of this nation's space research and development, it has been scientists trained in private or state-operated universities and employed by them, as well as research-intensive companies in the aerospace and defense industries that have done the bulk of the work. The Academy attracted the first generation of space scientists to a truly cosmopolitan undertaking far beyond the laboratory. The third salient feature has been the international participation in U.S. space exploration. The National Academy of Sciences represents the United States on COSPAR, the International Committee on Space Research. But more importantly, from their beginnings in 1957, when the National Academy of Sciences masterminded our participation in the International Geophysical Year, our space science missions have combined launches, payloads, and experiments from around the world. Chartered in 1863 to serve the federal government by investigating whenever called upon and report upon any subject of science or art, the Academy's 50 charter members were, in fact, a far more diverse group than is suggested by the 10 scientific lazzaroni who worked for its creation. Together, they presented a wonderful portrait of science in mid-19th century America, with members from nascent extractive industries, the U.S. Army and Navy, doctors, lawyers, one insurance actuary, and several dedicated and capable amateurs, as well as college and university faculty. By the end of World War II, the Academy had received over $67 million in today's dollars in war-related contracts from federal agencies for advisory and administrative services. These contracts ranged from studies of materials to potentialities of biological warfare, from combat clothing and equipment to the selection and training of aircraft pilots. In short, the National Academy of Sciences brought to the dawn of space exploration a vital legacy of experience with a broad range of research in which the distinction between pure and applied science was an academic distraction at best. In accumulating this experience, the Academy had formed working relationships among the individuals and institutions capable of performing a broad range of research and a solid appreciation of the needs of its federal client agencies. The Academy was the United States' representative to the International Council of Scientific Unions, the ICSU, which asked it to develop and direct the scientific and technological program for the United States, participation in the IGY, coordinating it with the ICSU. In turn, the Academy would coordinate funding with the National Science Foundation, which would have to come from congressional appropriations. Thus, on February 10, 1953, Academy President Detlef Bronk formed the United States National Committee for the IGY, USNC IGY, and appointed UCLA Professor of Physics, Dr. Joseph Kaplan, as chairman. Lloyd Berkner, an electrical engineer and ionosphere physicist at the Carnegie Institution, and Sidney Chapman of the International Special Committee of the IGY also served on the 16-member American Committee. Berkner took over as chairman after Kaplan resigned the following year. Launching a satellite to fly over the territory of another sovereign nation required presidential approval. Elected in 1952, Eisenhower was the first president since Ulysses S. Grant to have had personal experience of the indiscriminate and unforgiving carnage of modern warfare. Millions of lives could be spared if military confrontation with the Soviet Union could be avoided, and untold amounts of money could be saved for domestic needs if a costly buildup of the military-industrial complex could be minimized. This would require ongoing and accurate assessments of the Soviet Union's actual fighting capabilities. If the international principle of freedom of space for objects in orbit could be established, all spacefaring nations could make foreign and military policy decisions on the basis of relatively accurate knowledge of each other's military capabilities. And what better object to establish that principle than a scientific satellite, orbiting over the Earth's airspace below as part of a peaceful international scientific venture? As inclined as President Eisenhower was to approve the Earth satellite program, the route to his desk was guarded by several agencies that need to vouch for the program's feasibility. Only the Defense Department could provide and operate the launch vehicles and communications networks. Since foreign governments were involved, the State Department would also have to give its support. For comparable reasons, the Academy would need the nod from the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. And then there was the tight-fisted Bureau of the Budget. Nevertheless, by all accounts, National Academy President Detlef Bronk, with the help of Lloyd Berkner and National Science Foundation Director Allan Waterman, gave persuasive briefing after briefing, participated in meeting after meeting, and discussion after discussion. In the end, they managed to funnel the necessary recommendations into the Oval Office. Thus it was that the opening of the International Geophysical Year, July 1st, 1957, was announced in the United States by the President, President Eisenhower, who, toward the end of his remarks, and I quote, said, "I should like to congratulate all who have helped to make our program possible, and particularly the National Academy of Sciences. Through its National Committee for the International Geophysical Year, the Academy has worked tirelessly to plan and coordinate the program in cooperation with other nations." The division of responsibilities among the Academy's U.S. National Committee, the Defense Department, and the National Science Foundation was sorted out over dinner at the Cosmos Club in July 1956 by Richard Porter, then chair of the technical panel, Allan Waterman of NSF, Admiral Rawson Bennett, director of the Office of Naval Research, and Clifford Furness, Donald Quarles' successor as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Development. Briefly, the Academy would be responsible for all scientific aspects of the program. The DoD would determine the workability of instruments proposed for the satellites, develop, procure, and launch the vehicles and deliver the satellites into orbit, confirm their orbits, provide logistical and technical support, as well as radio tracking and a telemetry experiment. Any public information required clearance from the DoD as well as the National Academy. The National Science Foundation was the fiscal agent. First and most fundamentally, the nation's space program would be a civilian and thus peaceful undertaking. Secondly, the scientific content of the program would be the responsibility of the scientific community, whether employed in the country's universities or, as was the case after 1958, employed in a civilian space agency. We now take this for granted, but it was never written in the stars that it should be so. National Academy President Detlef Bronk undoubtedly had misgivings about the NASA bill that would be introduced into and approved by the House of Representatives in 1958. The bill lacked any provision comparable to the National Science Board that advised the National Science Foundation for a group of outside scientists to oversee the NASA space science program. And so on June 4th, Bronk invited Waterman of NSF, Lloyd Berkner, Herbert York, chief scientist of ARPA, which managed all civil and military space activity between 1957 and the opening of NASA in October of '58, and Hugh Dryden, director of NASA's predecessor agency, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, to meet with him at the Academy to design what would become the new Space Science Board. The principal mission of the board would be to ensure that the Academy could and would represent the views of American scientists in U.S. space program planning and to promote international cooperation in space research. Unfortunately, from the SSB's perspective, President Eisenhower declined to name NASA Administrator Hugh Dryden a Johns Hopkins PhD in physics and director of the NACA since 1947. Dryden was a familiar presence at the National Academy of Sciences, where he was expected to be named to the NASA post. Instead, Eisenhower gave the nod to T. Keith Glennon, a Yale-trained electrical engineer and a proven executive in corporate, government, and academic organizations, most recently as president of the Case Institute of Technology. Glennon's organization of NASA headquarters placed space science at a third-tier management level, where Homer Newell would head the Space Science Directorate in the Office of Spaceflight. As for its space science program, NASA's official policy was that the agency and it alone would formulate a national program of space research, albeit from recommendations not only of the National Academy of Sciences Space Science Board, but from proposals and suggestions of educational research institutions, industry, and other contractors, and from internally generated ideas. The Space Sciences Board, to its diminished role, was to become NASA's chief critic. The board complained to the President's Science Advisory Committee that NASA was doing science in-house and thus failing to support university-based scientific research. It complained that NASA was neglecting basic science, that government-conducted science was not as good as science done in university and industrial laboratories, that NASA's contractor payload engineers were failing to involve the payload scientists sufficiently in the work. But all was not critical. SSB Chair Lloyd Berkner would break the mold among many space scientists and publicly distance himself from their opposition to any man-in-space program. Instead, he supported human exploration as the emotive fuel necessary to sustain a successful national space program. As often happens in Washington, much of the energy behind controversy, in this case the SSB's public complaints against NASA, is dissipated by a change of administrations. After the Democratic Party recaptured the White House in November 1960, John F. Kennedy announced what became the Apollo manned lunar landing program. At the urging of Lyndon Johnson and others, he named James E. Webb NASA administrator to pull it off. Meanwhile, Lloyd Berkner wrestled his colleagues on the Space Science Board into adopting a policy statement supporting NASA's human exploration of the moon and planets. Webb was one of this country's sharpest and most talented public servants, a veteran of the Hill, the Department of State, and the Bureau of the Budget. His appointment also introduced a sea change in NASA relations with space scientists. Webb understood from his own Washington experience that if NASA was going to be able to achieve its mission, every congressional district, every research industry, and the entire aerospace industry would have to have a material interest in the agency's success. This meant that NASA's procurements, its contracts, and research grants needed to be genuinely accessible to everyone across the country. This also meant, in Webb's reorganization of NASA headquarters, an Office of Space Sciences on a par with an Office of Manned Spaceflight. The Space Science Board soon became an officially acknowledged direct advisory group to the administrator. For its part, the National Academy and Space Science Board accepted, eventually, the fact of human exploration and the political realities that NASA had to deal with in serving many constituencies while doing justice to its founding mission. The role of the SSB became to take the long view, a perspective difficult for agency managers to maintain during the constant political and budgetary changes afflicting government programs. It has done so, the Space Science Board, through its periodic summer studies, through its decadal studies of future space research needs, and through investigations responding to federal agency or congressional requests. This can be illustrated by the influence it and the Academy exercised over three key decisions. The first was the board's successful promulgation in 1963 of a code to avoid the contamination of the moon, planets, and other celestial bodies, a code that was adopted by the International Council of Scientific Unions as well as NASA and the DoD. The board has continued to promote methods for preventing contamination of celestial objects by space probes. Another was a successful effort to persuade NASA, once the initial Apollo lunar landings were completed, to train scientists to serve as astronauts and develop a genuine science astronaut program. From 1971 through December 1972, NASA flew 4 primarily scientific Apollo missions, 14 through 17, to the moon with full-fledged scientists trained as astronauts on their crews. Astronauts soon became regular members of human spaceflight crews. A third example is the board's 2005 assessment at NASA's request of the comparative benefits and risks of a robotic mission versus a manned shuttle mission to service the Hubble Space Telescope one last time in its then anticipated life. The board argued persuasively that a shuttle surfacing mission was well worth the same risks that were being taken to service the International Space Station. The 5th and last servicing mission for the orbiting telescope was flown in May of 2009, and the Hubble Space Telescope continues to generate extraordinary images of the heavens to this day. In the mid-1980s, the Space Science Board changed its name to the Space Studies Board to recognize that its portfolio had expanded from the academic space science disciplines that emerged from the IGY to preparing studies and testimonies not only for the Congress and NASA, but for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration created in 1970 and the U.S. Geological Survey. Unlike the Soviet Union, the National Academy of Sciences had no power to command the human and material resources necessary to launch a space program. It had to work within the political and fiscal realities of our system of constitutional government. In the course of coordinating the necessary moving parts within those realities, it shaped the template for the following decades of space exploration, not only by the United States, but to a large extent by our international partners in space. The Space Science Board has provided guidance in the short run, and it has become a vital source of vision in the long run. Thank you.
The first of our panelist speakers is also an historian. Allan Needell is a curator for the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, where he is responsible for its Apollo artifacts collection. He's recently completed a multi-year effort to preserve the only Saturn V launch vehicle made of flight-qualified components. He's the author of a biography of Lloyd Berkner. The title is Science, Cold War, and the American State, Lloyd V. Berkner and the Balance of Professional Ideals. He's also the editor of a collection of essays, The First 25 Years in Space. Allan?
Thank you. Sylvia mentioned the role of Lloyd Berkner in suggesting and managing the IGY program. And as the first chairman of the Space Science Board. Having studied his career, I'll use my time to briefly review Berkner's association with the Academy and to connect this session with the one that we had earlier this morning. Following his service during World War II in the Navy Bureau of Aeronautics as the leader of the radar and communications electronics procurement effort of the Bureau, and as primary liaison with the scientists working at the MIT Radiation Laboratory on radar, Berkner was among the most influential figures to come out of the war, negotiating a post-war partnership between American defense and scientific communities, the partnership that we discussed this morning. During the Truman administration, he built for himself an impressive reputation as an organizer, administrator, and government advisor. In 1946 and 47, he served as the first post-war manager of the so-called Joint Research and Development Board, whose job it was to evaluate defense-related research and development activity, to prevent duplication, and to maintain close relations between the nation's defense and scientific communities. He also served as an official advisor in the Department of State. Now, never actually earning an advanced degree himself, it was with great satisfaction and professional pride that in 1948, he accepted formal nomination to the Academy. Especially welcome was the prospect that in addition to recognizing both his own scientific achievements and his organizing activities, the Academy would provide him with further opportunities to organize scientists as a force for addressing national problems. It wasn't long before Berkner was asked to take part in Academy business. In July of '48, Isaiah Bowman, president of Johns Hopkins, agreed to a State Department request to chair a special Academy conference on research in Antarctica. Aware that he had participated in the 1928 bird expedition to the south to Antarctica, Bowman asked the Academy, and specifically Berkner, to contribute a report on ionospheric research in that region, Berkner's research specialty. Berkner agreed and proposed a relatively ambitious Antarctic research program to study atmospheric electricity and magnetism. The program, I should say, was not unlike that which would be undertaken during the IGY. In his report, Berkner in fact emphasized that such research should best be accomplished by the combined efforts of scientists from many nations. Berkner's recommendations made a great deal of scientific sense, but it's likely also no coincidence that they also provided the State Department with just the sort of diplomatic ammunition it had been looking for. Contemporary documents reveal that it was the military that had sparked this sudden State Department concern with Antarctica. The Navy feared that the Soviet Union might try to use bases established there to gain control over shipping lanes, and unwilling to allow the Soviets to pursue sovereignty claims in Antarctica, military planners pressed the State Department to increase their diplomatic efforts to forestall such action. Now, it's hardly remarkable that Berkner would champion international cooperation, scientific cooperation in Antarctica, having worked throughout the 1930s cultivating just such cooperation in ionospheric research. What is remarkable, I think, is how well and with how little apparent strain the revival of such efforts could be made to mesh with the newer and now increasingly secret peacetime national security agendas just then emerging. Berkner was confident in his belief, one that was widely shared among scientists of the era, that the interests of increasing knowledge, promoting intellectual freedom around the world, and American national security interests neatly coincided. Berkner was uniquely prepared for the sensitive role of middleman between the world of science and the emerging Cold War national security state. Berkner's role at the now legendary April 1950 dinner party at the Silver Spring, Maryland home of James Van Allen, in which planning for a third international polar year was begun, the polar year eventually becoming the IGY, is perhaps the story best known about Berkner from the scientists in general and scientists that he later led as the Space Science Board chairman following Sputnik. It's no coincidence, I think, that the dinner party occurred during the same month that Berkner completed another major project involving the National Academy, and that is the preparation of the so-called Berkner Report, Science and Foreign Relations of 1950. During the early part of 1949, with Secretary of State Dean Acheson's concurrence, then Under-Secretary of State James Webb, the same man who would later work with Berkner in the Space Science Board to promote human spaceflight during the Apollo program, established an internal review of State Department responsibilities in the field of science. Berkner was tapped to manage the report-writing effort. He arranged to survey and make recommendations on, quote, the international flow of scientific information. Writing over Webb's signature to A.N. Richards, the president of the Academy, Berkner invited the Academy to assist in whatever manner it may consider appropriate. He suggested the appointment of an advisory committee within the National Research Council to review the analysis and recommendations once they were prepared by internal government working groups, he asked the NRC to produce its own to produce its own paper to reflect the views of universities, research organizations, and other non-governmental entities concerned with the problem. By using the National Academy and the NRC in the preparation of his State Department report, Berkner added prestige and influence to his conclusions and helped ensure that American scientists would feel that they had at least some say in the recommendations that would be made. To bolster that impression, in early April, prior to the Van Allen dinner, Berkner attended the business session of the National Academy's annual meeting to formally report on the results of the State Department study and the contributions made by the Academy. Quoting him, "It's hardly necessary to say that there has been a steadily increasing relationship between science and our international relations and foreign policy. The survey group he had directed agreed from the outset that its objective was, again quoting, to develop detailed recommendations on the most effective means of utilizing the functions and facilities of the State Department for meeting the needs of United States science and for strengthening national security. Among the objectives were the furtherance of understanding and cooperation among the nations of the world and the promotion of scientific progress and the benefits to be derived therefrom. Berkner was also determined to emphasize the stake he believed his Academy audience had in the more controversial aspects of the forthcoming report. International science policy, he stated, should also be devoted to, quote, the maintenance of that measure of security of the free peoples of the world required for the continuance of their intellectual, material, and political freedom. What he was talking about were far more sensitive aspects of the topic of science and foreign relations. Science was then perceived as an increasingly important component of the intelligence community's responsibilities, and Berkner, in that regard, also prepared a classified appendix to the 1950 report outlining ways in which American scientists could be of direct assistance to the intelligence community. One of the major recommendations was to increase participation in international activities along with the creation of both overt and covert intelligence operations to exploit them. In fact, in his work for the State Department, Berkner was walking a delicate line, attempting to serve as a broker between the national security bureaucracy and the professional community of scientists. Although the National Academy audience he had emphasized the service to the State Department could provide in the confines of the State Department meeting rooms, in the classified documents, he emphasized government's hidden agenda. The revelation of Berkner's secret agenda should not, I think, be taken at all to indicate a lack of sympathy for the goals, needs, and ideals of his fellow scientists. Subsequent actions suggest that he remains sincerely interested in furthering those goals and in pursuing the proposals made in the unclassified report, not only for nationalistic reasons, but also because of an abiding personal interest in international science. As we've heard, the polar year proposal and the resulting IGY had much real scientific merit. It also coincided directly with the separate needs and goals of several agencies of the federal government, and that it did so did not bother Berkner to any extent. To the contrary, the opportunity to work simultaneously for science and for the nation had a tremendous appeal to him as a planner, administrator, and scientist. What is important to emphasize, there was little indication in 1950 that Berkner personally felt any sense of inconsistency or contradiction between the spheres of science and national security. To him, as to most of the leaders of the scientific establishment that emerged after World War II, the goals of science, the goals of the international community of free men, and the interests of America neatly coincided. It's too easy, I think, for present-day observers to forget that and to project backwards conflicts and cross-purposes that would emerge at a later time and under different circumstances. For the IGY itself was replete with similar tensions and contradictions, and Berkner played a leading role. We talked about the satellite proposal in engineering that and actually organizing to get the international community to request us to launch a satellite rather than it seeming like it was something that we had proposed ourselves.
Thank you, Ruth. Actually, Messenger is an orbit around Mercury, but otherwise everything you said is wonderfully correct. I will start out by saying I'm not an historian in the usual sense. I was a schoolboy during IGY. I never met Lloyd Berkner, so I elected to focus my remarks on the role of the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council in helping to formulate strategic plans for space exploration through the decadal strategies that Sylvia mentioned in her remarks, and that I partially witnessed as a young planetary scientist. The Space Science Board, as Sylvia introduced, was well underway, but even in the early 1970s, they were a source of advice to NASA and their space programs, primarily by reacting to NASA's plans and providing feedback to agency strategies and agency programs. And what changed was the kind of advice that the National Academy and the NRC provided to NASA, from reacting to presentations on programs to offering long-term strategies in which there were prioritized recommendations specifically to accomplish scientific objectives over a long time frame. To those who know the space scientists, it should not come as a surprise that this strategic way of thinking came first from the astronomers. In fact, I regard astronomers as the greatest historians in the sciences, possibly in all of intellectual pursuits, and that they study the history of our surroundings, going back to the Big Bang, and so have 14 billion years of history on which to base all of their observations. It was an NRC committee led by Academy member Jesse Greenstein, who, building on a tradition that the astronomers had developed even in the 1960s to think about long-term planning for ground-based instruments, to assemble the first strategic plan for space astronomy and astrophysics. It was a landmark report. It foresaw, not in the decade after their own report, but in the decade to follow, the Hubble Space Telescope, and it set out other strategic goals. It did not come easily to the astronomical community because they made hard choices and they prioritized, and so inevitably there were advocates of programs who did not see their programs at the top of the list. But that was a wonderful example that was followed just a couple of years later by the planetary science community. At that time, Al Cameron was chairman of the Space Science Board, and Jerry Wasserberg, both Academy members at the time, was chairman of a committee called Committee on Planetary and Lunar Exploration, or COMPLEX. And that committee was asked again to react to NASA plans, and Wasserberg said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to follow the examples set by Jesse Greenstein and the astronomers, and we're going to create a decadal strategy based on scientific objectives. We're not simply going to comment on missions. It took 3 reports to put together the whole solar system. Wasserberg led the reports on the outer planets, on the inner planets, and then he handed off to a younger scientist to do the 3rd report on comets and asteroids. But that then set a framework for giving advice on solar system exploration that was novel for NASA. It took the heliophysics community and the earth science community longer to follow suit. The first decadal strategy in heliophysics was 2003, and in earth science, 2007. Nonetheless, these have been extraordinarily influential. They, just to characterize them, typically take a 10-year time frame. Most importantly, they provide community input on the prioritization of scientific objectives or mission concepts. There's often a very strong involvement of a large segment of the community through multiple panels, through town hall meetings and workshops. There's often also a balance, a recognition that any space program needs a balance between the largest, most ambitious missions and medium-sized and smaller missions. And in particular, the small missions are treasured by the community because they are often initiated by a single principal investigator. They're often based at a university, run by university groups, and so they give a richness and a nimbleness to the space program that can't be achieved with only large programs. We heard the interesting comment from Maxine Singer earlier about one of the reasons for the effectiveness of the Norman Augustine's gathering storm was the role of the chair in following up a report and publicizing the findings and making sure that many audiences understood the importance of the recommendations. And that provides an interesting introduction to a comment I will make, that the decadal strategies that I have seen in the space sciences have varied enormously in their success. Their success as measured by how closely NASA followed the recommendations in the reports, and how many of the objectives, or how few, after 10 years were in fact achieved. And the effectiveness of the chair, like Norman or Augustine, was part of the reason for the differences in success, but there were many other reasons. Some of the strategies were too ambitious. They set out too many objectives. They didn't make enough hard choices for a decade. Some have been changed by the fact that space is now increasingly international, much more so than it was at the beginning of the space program. And many scientific objectives are met by space programs from other spacefaring nations. And of course, there are always, often, changes in fiscal climate between the time that a strategy is written and the time that NASA has to prepare a budget and defend it for a given set of programs. So it's been a bit uneven, but on balance, I think the record has been a strongly positive one, that through the committees organized by the National Research Council and national academies, that space science has had a long-term set of goals that provide a guidance to the choice of programs. Let me end by giving some personal remarks of my own history with respect to these strategies. I was tapped as a very young scientist to participate in one of these early strategic planning committees, complex, for the solar system, for planetary science. I was tapped by Jerry Wasserberg, who went out of his way to recruit young scientists to serve on that planning committee. The business of space science is one with long-term plans and many, many years between plans and execution. So the wisdom of Wasserberg was to recognize that many of the objectives that would be set out, even in a decadal strategy, would not be achieved by the youngest scientists in the community, by the oldest scientists in the community, I should say, but would have to wait for the growth and maturity of younger scientists, and he wanted to make sure that they were part of the strategic planning. So I helped to write 2 of the 3 decadal strategies for solar system exploration, and after that I was tapped, still at a young stage in my career, to chair the first strategy for the exploration of the Earth from space that is now more than 30 years old. To illustrate the advantage of tapping young scientists, I was one of 2 members of Wasserberg's committee that wrote the strategy for the further exploration of Mercury. We wrote this chapter in a report back in 1976 and 1977. It was only 2 years after Mariner 10, the last of the Mariner spacecraft, had flown by Mercury 3 times. And there were no plans to return a spacecraft to Mercury at that time. In fact, the community did not know how to send a spacecraft into orbit around Mercury. That wasn't discovered until the next decade. But there I was as a scientist about 30 years old, writing a strategy for exploring the planet Mercury. And then 20 years later, after that report was published, I was in a position to propose a mission to explore Mercury with an orbiter. And it took a couple of years. NASA selected it. We built our spacecraft. We launched. And we're finally carrying out a strategy that I helped write 35 years ago to explore the innermost planet in ways that we could foresee back in the 1970s on the basis of obvious things to do, but we didn't know the celestial mechanical tools to send an orbiter, and we simply weren't in a position to do so. So there's some wisdom to including young scientists in these strategies, and one has to take quite liberally the notion of a decade. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Maria Zuber. She is the E.A. Griswold Professor of Geophysics at MIT, where her research group has been involved, here we go again with pronunciation, I hope I get it all right, Gravity Recovery and Interior Laboratory, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the Mars Exploration Rovers, the Near-Earth Asteroid Rendezvous, and the Mars Observer.
Okay, well, I bring a rather interesting perspective, I think, to a panel dealing with history, where we're talking about the International Geophysical Year. So the International Geophysical Year initiated in July of 1957, and I hadn't been born in July of 1957. So let me tell you about how I spent the early days of the space age. And this is now legendary in my family and arguably prescient for how my life progressed. I spent it in my playpen and looking at the TV, and whenever there was something about space on the TV, I would jump up and down and squeal with delight and point to the television. And back then, my parents said they knew that I was going to study space. And so for me, before I even recognized it, space has had a sense of wonder. And one of the most fantastic things about science is the sense of wonder that science projects. And we need to talk more about the sense of wonder. What we do as scientists is extremely difficult, but we seek to understand things that aren't known. And what greater challenge is there for a young person to know what isn't known? And so that's the kind of perspective that I want to try to bring to my remarks here. I want to take the opportunity to think about, excuse me, about the influence of the IGY on just how the way that Earth and space sciences have developed as disciplines. So what I'm going to do here is I want to make just a couple of remarks about the IGY and give a couple of examples of successful programs and their influences from the National Academy of Sciences. Talk a little bit about some programmatic contributions that the NRC has made to space sciences, and then circle back at the end to some final reflections on the lasting influences of the IGY. So the IGY, as mentioned in the initial remarks, were modeled after the success of the International Polar Year. And the International Polar Years took place in 1882-83 and 1932-33. So we recognized back many, many decades the importance of the poles in the Earth system. Okay, and so that I want to just go slightly off message here, and to express great concern about observations of the Antarctic that we are missing right now because of the government shutdown. Observations that should be taken in Antarctic Spring and can only be taken in Antarctic Spring and aren't being taken right now because they've had to do a shutdown of the Antarctic program and put it into caretaker mode. So we can only hope, and so for what reason? For no reason. And we can only hope that that program gets restaffed up and that those observations be taken because of the critical importance of the extreme environments of the poles to studying the Earth's weather, climate, and also space observations as well. So back to the IGY. The timing of the IGY was absolutely perfect, almost in a cosmic sense. And its timing I believe, contributed to its significance, okay? Because the IGY was initiated just prior to the dawn of the space age with the launch of Sputnik, which occurred in October of 1957. And the observations taken in the IGY actually provided the fundamental modus operandi for how we monitor our home planet and explore other bodies from the standpoint of global coordinated observation. We embraced the notion of Earth as a planet, and this benefited from comprehensive interdisciplinary study of the space environment, geomagnetism, geodetic positioning, meteorology, and seismology. All of these were components of the IGY. Okay. There is immense value from satellites that provide global weather and solar activity monitoring to GPS constellation that provides navigational capability that is now available on our iPhones. Okay, but this idea of the global coordinated observations that included global geodesy and knowing precisely where we were initiated back in a global sense from the IGY. This set the stage for the way that NASA observes the planets. Okay, the way that NASA observes planets is they do a flyby, and then that is followed by a global comprehensive set of observations and a global reconnaissance. You heard a couple of the satellite missions that were talked about actually had the word reconnaissance in their titles. And then that is followed by in situ detailed observations that are tied into the context of the global observations. So even in studying Earth, having an observation in situ at a given place, unless it is interpreted in a global context of observations, does not have its maximum value. Okay. Now let me give you two examples of projects that were a part of the space age, one dealing with Earth, one with Earth and then with space, where the NAS did not initiate it but played a role. Okay. One is the NASA Crustal Dynamics Project. Okay. So at the time of the NASA Crustal Dynamics Project, which was in the 1970s, it really exploited new measurement technologies. Okay, these include very long baseline interferometry that used quasar to provide precise timing calibration so that observations at very different places on the Earth, very far apart, could be coordinated so that we could get precise distances. Satellite laser ranging, sending lasers up to satellites and getting precise timing, which allowed us to do orbit determination of satellites to unprecedented levels, and lunar laser ranging, where every month we ranged up to retroreflectors on the lunar surface to measure the distance to the moon, which allowed us to measure the 2 centimeter per year recession of the moon from the Earth, as well as perturbations in the moon's dynamics. Okay. The NASA Crustal Dynamics Project greatly advanced our understanding of geodynamics of the Earth. It made measurements, present-day measurements of the drifts of the tectonic plates, which could then be compared to the measurements over many millions of years that were determined from ships. It advanced our understanding of various geodynamical aspects of the Earth, such as the rotation, which could be related in some ways to the dynamics of the ocean-atmosphere system, and it improved our understanding of the Earth-Moon system, which has relevance to fundamental physics. So understanding the dynamics of the Earth-Moon system is key in making, in testing things such as the equivalence principle. Okay, so the Crustal Dynamics Project actually initiated late 70s, early 80s. It was led by NASA. but it was a topic of keen interest to the Space Science Board, okay? In fact, the Space Science Board requested briefings from NASA on the crustal dynamics program frequently because they recognized the value of this problem and took many, many opportunities to underscore the importance of the measurements that were being made and to advocate for more and continued measurements. And I should say that they appreciated the breadth of the contributions so much. The most recent presentation on the crustal dynamics project to the Space Studies Board now was only a few years ago, reviewing the success on how it's worked and trying to take the lessons learned from that global project to apply to other space science projects. The second example that I will give you is a National Academy of Sciences report on Earth gravity from space, which NASA commissioned of the NAS because NASA had an interest in doing a gravity mission and could not get sufficient community support. They recognized, the committee on which I served, recognized the technology had advanced so much that it was actually not only possible to map the gravity field, but to map small variations in the gravity field. And it turned gravity in from a static modeling of the globe to being able to measure important issues in terms of hydrology and weather and the melting of the ice sheets. Okay, so when this report was initiated, this wasn't understood, and actually this committee did a significant amount of original research, which is very odd and unusual for an NAS committee to actually do original research rather than reviewing existing research, which led to the selection of the GRACE mission, which is mapping the Earth right now, and also the technology wound up leading to the GRAIL mission, which mapped the moon the last couple of years, which I wound up leading. Of course, I couldn't have anticipated this at the time. So some pragmatic contributions of NRC reports to the advancement of space science. Sean talked about decadal surveys. Well, other more targeted reports looked at the development of space technologies for both science and human exploration, assessing particular architectures for the Mars program, reviewing scientific contributions that should be undertaken for the International Space Station, and developing a strategy for astrobiology, which was a very interdisciplinary study. So in closing, let me just review a couple of other contributions of the IGY. First of all, it encouraged international cooperation, initially as a thaw in the Cold War. It developed the World Data Center, and this was done mainly because in the international polar years, many of the observations that were taken were lost, and they wanted this to be avoided, and this became basically the poster child for how we should archive and save data. And finally, there was an explicit objective to engage the public in the IGY to increase awareness of science, which I think has really influenced more recent activities to engage youth to inspire STEM education. And I'll stop there.
The next 15 minutes is devoted to what is called in my notes a moderated discussion between the speaker and, well, between all the speakers. So would, go ahead.
Let me start, let me start, if I may, as a segue from the previous session, where the question asked, all those reports, are they efficacious? We all know the jokes about government reports and committee reports sitting on the shelf and they're done. And what we've been talking about also, a vehicle of progress is the report. During one big chunk of my many years at NASA, I was responsible for administering the NASA Advisory Council and committees. The SSB is, of course, administered by the National Academy of Sciences. So I had frequent occasions to think, what is all this worth? I mean, are we all wasting our time and so forth and so on? And the insight I finally gained, and I think it applies to what we've all talked about here thus far, is that the report itself is not the product. The report is a record of what has already happened. And what has already happened are all those conversations, all those discussions, all that background research that I alluded to in my own talk. The report, the request for a report, the stimulus for a report, the question that's asked, what that is a forcing factor. And that term is not original with me, it comes from a colleague, but to me it is right on the money. It is a forcing factor that insists that all the participants, all the parties actually openly discuss this, that, and the other thing. Now, those of us who come from professions and academic backgrounds where we just love talking, and talking is the coin of our realm, we take that for granted. But if you are and perhaps Sean will disagree, but I hope not, but if you are a manager of an organization or a manager of an institute, and especially a manager in the US federal government, now that we have been reminded of what fun it is to try to run a government program in our system, you have very few occasions and very few requirements to sit back and say, let's really have a good look at this with people who know what's involved. And that's what happens when a committee is asked to write a report. So by the time you get to the report, that thing on the shelf that's covered in dust, it's okay that it's covered in dust because its work has been done, has been largely done.
So could I comment on the values of these reports? Sean and I have both had the privileges of leading NASA missions, and so in the competed missions, when one puts together the proposal, the first hurdle is science, and so front and center when one constructs a proposal with a scientific objective, pointing to the decadal study is absolutely essential to having it recognized by the community that what you are proposing is something that the scientific community has had input into and thinks is important. So, so they, those reports have been extremely influential in terms of guiding, what the top science questions are.
When I was trying to analyze the things I was talking about, I used the concept of compartmentalization and how important it was for instance, the Space Science Board to be able to act as though, and in fact actually focus on scientific issues, when obviously there are other issues involved. And I guess my question to you both is you're of course aware that there's the competing between other branches of science, between human spaceflight and robotic spaceflight, that there are international, that there are, and my point was that there were certain individuals, and Berkner was the one I used as a template, whose job it was to be an interlocutor, but in one sense to protect the ability of each of the compartments to act within their own criteria and not have to be thinking about national security, not be thinking about competing between budgets for this program or that program. And I guess the question is, how isolated are you able to be? How compartmentalized are you able to be in these negotiations? And who is providing the middleman services to guide you to make sure that conflicts down the road don't undermine what you're trying to accomplish?
Allan, let me take a first stab at answering your question and then pass it to Maria. At least for the Space Studies Board, as it's now called, committees that look at strategic plans for further space exploration, the modern committees are very aware of all of the issues you have raised. Limits on budget, international competition and opportunities for international partnership, missions that are already in the planning stage, concept studies that have been developed on mission opportunities. And it is in that context that the strategic plans are developed. And in contrast to some of the earlier strategic plans, there's a fiscal component that is overlaid on these plans, and that resources are provided by the sponsoring agency of expertise in how to cost missions and how to estimate the budgetary impact of different choices in the capabilities of those missions, so that even compared to the pioneering decadal strategies of the 1970s in astronomy and planetary science, the decadal strategies now are rather strongly based in some of the very practical matters that you have raised. Partially in response to Sylvia, I'll come at an issue that I raised earlier in another direction. The strategies have not been equally well written in the fields that I've followed, and they've not been equally up to the challenge of making difficult decisions among opportunities. But there are some examples that one can point to that absolutely require the community to come behind a major, very expensive mission in order to have the sustaining support to go through multiple administrations and multiple federal budgets and to be flown. A prime example is the Hubble Space Telescope. We're seeing a repeat of that with the James Webb Space Telescope. The community had, in the case of those two missions, the astronomy community, which is a little different from mine, had to come together through the decadal planning process and put an extremely high priority on those space missions because of their cost. And they were able to do so because of the exceptional scientific product that those capabilities, those assets in space would produce, as the Hubble Space Telescope has amply demonstrated. So the reports don't all gather dust, and some of them have very long-term impact, and as Maria said, they're utilized even by the community of scientists who are responding to calls for PI-led missions of the smaller sort. That strategy is really a community product, and it's one that the community utilizes to continue to design the whole space program that our nation follows. Maria, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add one thing on as far as international cooperation is concerned. I think the people who populate the committees seek guidance on what the role of international cooperation is, and that tends to be a decision that is above the pay grade of the committee, and sometimes, quite frankly, it's in favor, and sometimes international cooperation falls out of favor. Scientists in general, I think, like to work together, and so when it's feasible to work together, they are willing and open towards doing so. it does tend to be problematic when administrations change or parties change in other countries where you're on a path and then the path all of a sudden changes. And so we all like science to be non-political, and so the more that it can be left that way, the better.
I want to clarify that in my remarks, I didn't mean to suggest that reports deserve only dust or generate only dust. No, no. What I meant to say is that the process that goes into the preparation is the key.
I have a quick question to ask you, Sean, and then we'll open up the conversation to the audience. Your last remarks, you said that some of the decadal reports are more useful to people in managerial positions than others, and I just wondered what the criteria of usefulness are.
Some of the best reports in strategic planning might not have been judged to be the most useful by the managers. They were most effective in laying out the priorities of the scientific communities in terms of objectives that had to be met by whatever missions the agency crafted and elected to fly. And sometimes those were difficult, and sometimes they posed challenges to managers. But to me, the most effective strategies were the ones in which there were clear priorities, that the top priorities were ones of sufficient importance that they clearly compelled an agency response sometime over the decadal time frame. And NASA is full of clever people, so they figure out how to address these technical challenges. But to have a guidebook on what scientifically is the greatest primacy, it may be a headache to the managers and the engineers for a while, but that's an effective strategy.
So, it's time for the conversation to broaden. If you have a question or a comment, please, would you go to the microphone? Do you want to start?
Yeah.
Lady.
I participate. Hello?
Yes.
I participate in the Mars project because the Planetary Society invited me. But I have a very simple question to you experts. Have, for example, has anybody seen God who traveled to the space?
I'm sorry.
For example, people who travel to the space, have they seen God?
They've seen God.
Yeah.
Question.
I can't answer that one.
Some think they have, a couple think they have.
Is there someone? Yes. I'm sorry, the lights are so bright on us, it's hard to see what's actually happening in the auditorium.
No problem. I just wanted to first say thank you for the panel conversation. I found it very helpful. And I also wanted to speak a little bit, I guess, to Maria's story, as well as one of the images that Sylvia put up of Wernher von Braun, who we all know is a popularizer of space science and a collaborator with Walt Disney, as well as other prominent authors of his time period. And I was particularly struck by your point about one of the projects of the sciences being to invoke a sense of wonder. And so clearly an important element to space science is its popularization in movies as well as in literature. And I assume for the most part, this has largely facilitated these programs and the public's interest in funding them as well as the government's interest. I'm just sort of curious that particularly in the past 20 years, with this shifting public interest toward sort of the new frontiers of genetics and molecular biology, as evidenced by the Human Genome Project, how have you seen these popular depictions shifting in the past 20 years? And also, how does the NAS collaborate with and or engage with these popular depictions of the space sciences?
Okay, well, I'll start with that, and somebody else could jump in if they want to. So, so space is just one example of many, many interesting areas of science. So, so I, in fact, remember I was riding my bike through Woods Hole one summer, and I saw a molecular biologist that I knew who was there, stopped me on my bike, said, "I heard you're testifying before Congress next week about the space program. Tell them I became a scientist because of seeing the astronauts in space." And he works on aging. Okay, so so I think that we should celebrate all areas of science, but space science, I think, will always have a special role, especially in kids. I mean, when you talk to people, all kids love space and dinosaurs, okay? And most of them grow out of that, but not all of them. But I think now how the National Academy should engage in that, you know, the National Academy should underscore the importance of science and education. You look at the materials that was produced yesterday, the communication awards were given for science, and the NAS sponsored that and really highlighted some magnificent efforts in books, you know, magazines, web materials of science writers and media people who were excellent communicators. And I believe that the NAS recognizing that work really is going to allow that work to become more widely known. So any efforts that the NAS could take in that regard to further, you know, disseminate the products of people who have those gifts to be able to communicate would be one way that they could play a role.
Yeah, one of the most exciting things to me that was done during the IGY was masterminded by the Smithsonian Observatory, which it organized amateur observers, students, kids, families, Aunt Gertrude, everybody, everywhere to do the visual tracking of the satellite. And the enthusiasm that that activity generated was surely immeasurable.
I hope that answers your question, because we have a number of other questioners. Richard?
I think Professor Zuber mentioned a mission for the space station, and Professor Solomon mentioned guidelines, although it didn't indicate what they were for costing. And I just wonder what goes on in deciding to put something on the space station instead of a free flyer. Is there a set of NASA small missions that happen routinely that are up for competition, so one can put something on them proposed instead of on the space station, or vice versa? How do you decide?
There are both kinds of programs, Richard. There are competitions for free-flying satellites in all of the disciplines of space science, and there are competitions for experiments on the space station that can be physical, chemical, biological sciences, can be human spaceflight related experiments. So both of those opportunities are there. A proposer would have to make the case that a particular set of measurements are best made from a satellite or a deep space probe or on the space station to be in a competitive advantage. But all those platforms are potentially available, but of course resource limited.
So the International Space Station, if one can put an experiment on there that makes sense, it's cost effective to do that because the platform exists. But given the nature of the ISS platform and the orbit that it's in around the Earth, it's not in an orbit that can observe the whole Earth. So that would eliminate a whole range of observations that could be taken. And you know, anything that needs a precise measurement to be taken, something with humans, you know, bumping around in it, it also is non-optimal. So, so you know, one would have to make the case that it's better to do it one way or the other, and opportunities are provided to make that case in a peer-reviewed sense.
I'm Türkan Gardenier from Pragmatica Corporation. I totally endorse the comments about communicating information about space. Both of our children went to space camp when they were in middle school, and that was a very enlightening experience for them. Then we kept taking them to annual meetings of AAAS, American Association for Advancements of Science, and as well as the American Statistical Association. And the quality of CDs and communication material that was available from NASA was very, very superior, and some of them they still keep. And personally, from a historical standpoint, NASA Goddard Space Center was the first host of a multi-agency development of geographical information systems. And I used to work for EPA at that time and used to drive from downtown DC to put in interagency material from various agencies that was contributed to that. And now, of course, GIS is in most of the research studies that we're doing. So I admire the work of NASA, as well as, of course, the Air and Space Museum, where we take all of our house guests to. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, you can...
Yes, NASA, great organization.
Excuse me one second,
All
but
right.
this gentleman's been waiting
Oh,
a
I'm
long
sorry.
time.
Sure.
So go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I just wonder, NASA has been a leader in the industry for many years with the best science, engineers, scholars. However, it has taken the back seat. It seems to be something has triggered that has letting other nations like Russia and China and South Korea to become now leaders on the space. What has triggered this?
Right.
Sounds like it answer for many moving parts. Big forces, I think. The immediate short-term answer that you will always get is, well, we can't pay as much. A lot of discussion about education, the pipeline, the quantity and preparation of young people coming into colleges and universities and so forth. Their economic factors, their cultural factors. That is a big question. I wish I could answer it in 5 minutes, but I sure can't.
Just a brief comment. Part of what I was trying to, the point I was trying to make is that in the 1950s, 1960s, there were a very unique set of circumstances which all came together to very much promote American civilian space activity. Those were historical contingent. Some of the things which led to encourage that have changed, and over time you can't expect that the motivations that existed in the 1960s are going to be the same motivations that you have in the 1980s. And so, as Sylvia said, there are a lot of large-scale changes that have undergone, that have happened.
A small addition. Back in the 1950s and 60s, one could discover new things with a relatively simple small satellite that 3 men could hold in the National Academy building. And they were wonderful discoveries because they were brand new. And now, to make advances over what has been learned already requires going to more difficult places, taking new kinds of instruments, taking larger spacecraft or larger telescopes, and it becomes more expensive. You see this in other fields. Particle physics requires ever larger facilities. And so in a constrained budgetary environment, given the rise of the excellence of science internationally and the competing efforts going on in space, it's inevitable that NASA is not able to do everything across the entire frontier of space science. But there's still some absolutely wonderful technical accomplishments that NASA continues to do. If you look at how the Curiosity rover was landed on Mars and the technical challenges that it took to deliver that vehicle to the surface of Mars, there's no outfit in the world other than NASA and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that could have accomplished that. So they are still leading technically, but they can't do everything.
Michael Neufeld, I'm one of Allan's colleagues at Air and Space Museum. I had a very specific question for Sean Solomon, because I just finished writing an article about, or drafting an article about the origins of New Horizons, the first mission to Pluto, and in that, a number of people, including Ed Weiler, who was at the time Associate Administrator, stated that the first planetary decadal survey was the one of 2002, 2003. And they perceived the complex reports of the 90s essentially as independent of NASA's initiative, and perhaps not very influential at a time, obviously, when Golden was administrator. So perhaps you could have a comment on that.
Well, one of the differences was that the complex reports divided the solar system into 3 pieces. So it wasn't a single strategy for the whole solar system. But the very first one on the outer planets led to Galileo. The second one on the inner planets led to Magellan. And the third one on minor bodies helped provide the scientific arguments for a variety of small missions to comets and asteroids. So if one measures effectiveness in terms of missions actually flown and scientific measurements made and objectives met, they were a decadal strategy, and they were the first in planetary science.
Okay, the red light is blinking at us all to say that it's time to conclude this session. I believe there was at least one other question, and I'm hoping that you can ask it of the panel members. No, it wasn't okay. Over lunch. And before I dismiss us all for lunch, I would just like to say, and I'm speaking for the other 2 of my collaborators on the sesquicentennial history, that part of our goal in this symposium was to learn something. We can't be experts on all the sciences we're reading about. We can't be experts on managing scientific missions of various sorts. And we hoped very much to be able to learn from your prepared remarks, from your interchange with each other, and from your interchange with the audience. And our expectations have been more than met, for which I thank all the speakers and everyone in the audience this morning.